On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, Americans go to the polls with control of the U.S. Congress at stake. What could results mean for the world?
Keep America great.
And big American companies do show up in piles at the CIIE. An insider puts his finger on the pulse of U.S. businesses in China. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. American voters go to the polls today, a referendum of sorts on the Trump administration. The ballots will determine whether the rest of Trump's presidency will be checked by a bluer Congress or if Republican Party keeps control of both chambers. A number of important state and local seats are also at stake, including governors of 35 states. The midterms are widely seen as a vote on the U.S. president's first 2 years in office. On the eve of the elections, Mr. Trump did the rounds in 3 Midwestern states to rally for Republican candidates.
I mean, who ever even heard of midterm? They don't even know what it is. I've had a lot of people say, I don't know what midterm is, but now I'm watching every single minute, and I'm going out to vote. But the key is you have to go out to vote. Because, in a sense, I am on the ticket. You got to go out to vote.
Oh, he wants people to vote. Republicans currently hold majorities in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. With their backing, Mr. Trump has delivered on his campaign promises of imposing tariffs, cutting taxes, and appointing conservative Supreme Court justices. If the Democrats wrest control of one or both chambers, though, they could stymie or even reverse Mr. Trump's policy. The U.S. president could face renewed pressure from the probe into his ties with Russia and be forced to disclose his tax returns. Former President Barack Obama from the Democrat Party has been rallying for Democratic candidates around the country, and he called the elections a test of the country's character. According to reports, this year's early voter turnout is set to hit a historical high. As the political division in America deepens, the turnout for both Democrats and Republicans is surging.
Because I don't want my taxes to go up, I don't want Georgia to become socialist, and I also don't want any messing around with the Second Amendment.
Well, I think this election is very important. I think it's important that we establish some kind of restraint on the current president, and the only way to do that it would be to make sure we get at least the House in the Democratic hands.
Another issue in this election, I think, is the problem of immigration, and I think we need to build a wall and stop that.
We're going to have another wave of women coming into office. We think it's really, really important, especially when we're appointing people like Gorsuch and Kavanaugh to our Supreme Court. We are motivated to change this.
The U.S. midterm election. For more about that, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Rong Ying, the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Also, we are joined by 2 other guests from the United States on the phone. I want to start with you, Mr. Rong, about that. What is China watching this midterm election about? What are some of the biggest issues you are very much interested in? Briefly.
I think for China, for the Chinese audience, certainly I think United States is such a big country, such a country that looms large for China's foreign policy and the issue that China cares. We certainly followed, watched very closely. But the interesting thing is that for Chinese and the world outside the United States, usually we used to watch the presidential election, stay up all night wanting to know the results. For midterm elections, seems that they are more local and they are not very much, I think, kind of concerned.
Right, but this year it's going to be very different. Why
Exactly.
is it different, and what are the issues you're looking at specifically?
Of course, looking at the change or the possible change of the structure in terms of which party, the Democrats or the Republicans, are going to take over the House or the Senate, because that would change the balance of power and putting pressure on the executives, which is Trump's president, and have implications for the policy.
Well,
and
now there's a lot of things going on right now between China and the United States. For example, whether the quote-unquote trade war, and also whether the other aspect of the bilateral relations is going to getting better or worse, and there's likely to be a meeting between the two presidents coming G20. So if there is a change of the midterm in terms of who will hold which house, the Senate or the House of Representatives, what would that mean for China?
I think for China, of course, if Republicans remains the control of the two chamber, which means that the Trump administration will be able to continue to pursue its agenda, both domestically and on the foreign front.
Right.
And the implication is that the trade disputes, the policy, Trump administration has been pursued regarding its trade disputes with China would continue. And that, of course, would have implications for China. As we know that it has been already announced Mr. Yang Jiechi, the highest sort of ranking diplomat in charge of diplomacy, is leading a delegation for diplomatic security talks with the United States, meeting the counterpart, and also
coming Friday.
That's right. It's expected that it will prepare the ground for the
right.
meeting, and that would also give that would be happen in the context, in the backdrop.
But Mr. Rong, let's just get the picture clear here. If the Democrats is taking one of those chambers, would that mean a real change when it comes to the approach of U.S.-China direction? Whether a party difference really make that much directional difference between China and the United States?
Well, I don't see that a direct sort of implication for that in terms of change. But rather in broader sense, I think if you look at the overall policy of the two parties, both the Democrats and Republicans, it seems that they don't have a big difference in how to deal with China, which is more confrontational, and it would be more difficult, at the time.
So if the Democrats taking one of the chambers, does it make much difference at all?
I think there are a lot of speculations. If you look at the agenda of the Democrats in the past, history will tell that Democrats also have its problem, also have the agenda to pursue, even on the trade. So one school of speculation that there might be a sort of competition for which party is tougher with China. But the other implication I have to point out is that if Democrat takes control the House, as a lot of people are speculating, then President Trump may be under pressure to think about changing some of approach tactically to deal with its foreign policy. Here, I think it may have implications for its way dealing with China.
Whether for better or worse, we don't know.
We don't know
at this point, even though there could be some change over there at the two chambers. Let me have on the phone Bruce Fein, who is the lawyer and also former Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan. Mr. Fein, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful, sir. What is your assessment of the turnout so far? What would that mean for the real battle for hours to take place before we see the result?
Well, a couple of observations. First, it's rather risky for the president to put his presidency on the line based on the outcome of the congressional elections midterm. There are two prior examples. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson basically went to the American people and said, if you support my war policies in World War I, you need to vote all Democrats in. And there was a huge shellacking and President Wilson lost his stature. He lost the League of Nations. As you well know, among other things, he acquiesced in Japanese acquisition and control over Shandong province, a disavowal of his own 14 points. Then Franklin Roosevelt in 1938 went to the American people and said, you need to vote in these Democrats, we need to change the Supreme Court, and he also had a shellacking. So one of the riskiest things with Mr. Trump is because he's made it clear in his campaigns for Republican candidates that if he loses, he's going to have lost his mandate. It will severely undercut his ability to influence Congress and get his way, because the American people would have sent a message, no, we are not supporting your policies. Now, on the specifics, if the Democrats win control of the House or the Senate, I think that's going to very much expose the weaknesses of the Trump administration. Yeah. They clearly will have the important power of oversight to obtain through subpoenas access not only to his past tax returns, but information regarding surveillance, regarding what they want to obtain concerning communications with the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, why he was firing Mr. Comey. It means all those kinds of things which could really hamstring his ability to do much in the next 2 years.
But Mr. Fain, we all know that the midterm election really is more or less a referendum about the president's work over the past 2 years. It's always been like that. Particularly now you have a president that is at least charismatic, if you agree with me about that adjective. So Mr. Fain, of course, you see a very big giant figure or elephant in the room, Mr. Donald Trump.
Well, that's where he is now. We'll find out after the balloting today and the counting whether or not he's, during his 2 years, he's received the support of the American people, because you rightly say he could be very strengthened if the Republicans win. But if he loses, he'll go from an elephant into a mouse. It'll look like a paper tiger. And that happens in politics. You can go from the peaks to the valleys very quickly, and that's what makes this particular election very risky for Mr. Trump. He's made claims that China and Russia and other countries are colluding, interfering with the elections, all these things that I think are very, very dubious, and the Democrats will expose them if they get control of Congress and get access to the proper information. So I just think until we get the outcome of the votes, we don't know whether this is going to be a home run for Mr. Trump or a strikeout.
But you know, Mr. Fain, that any one of the two parties could take advantage of the whether true or not accusations against the other parties, saying, well, you have some problems during election, and they could also accuse foreign governments of saying, oh, you interfere into our own elections. Whether that is true or not, well, the investigation would take a long time. So the question is, in this very dramatic geopolitical changing time, what would this election mean inside the United States and its interactions with the geopolitics that we have been witnessing over the past few months? Mr. Fain.
Well, my view is that our relations with China certainly would improve if the Democrats obtain ascendancy in either the House or the Senate. Mr. Trump has been very belligerent, not only in trade, but in the South China Sea, with regard to keeping so-called missile systems in South Korea, accusing the Chinese as being the next boogeyman like Russia in interfering with U.S. elections. We indicted Chinese alleged hackers for various and sundry things. He's clearly escalating. And not only that, he's trying to have more military training exercises in the Philippines. Basically, he's trying to encircle China, if you will. That is something I do not think the Democrats will believe is a sensible program whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense for us to challenge China's sphere of influence when we have our own that we've kept for 200 years in the Caribbean and Latin America with the Monroe Doctrine. So I think it'll tone down and increase the likelihood that we will be able to avoid a trade war that does neither good for either party. if the Democrats take control. On the other hand, if the Republicans keep control, I think it's very troublesome. We are looking at a further escalation. And I don't know where that leads, but it's not going to be positive for either China or the United States.
Mr. Rong, here in the Beijing studio, earlier we have several discussions about what this midterm election is going to be about. It's about the economy, it's about geopolitics. Many of us agree it's going to be about jobs. It's also going to be Donald Trump. In a way, he set himself over there as a big campaign issue. Mr. Rong, what do you make of the political divisions that the U.S. has witnessed over the past few years, from the election of Donald Trump until today, which is the day of the midterm election?
I think the political division or the partisanship has been there for quite a long time. And I don't know, I mean, whatever result would come out from this midterm election will change. But it is true that if the sort of balance of power between, I mean, if the Republicans maintain the two houses, then I think President Trump would be sort of balanced, and in the sense that is the Trumpism that would be there to stay. Otherwise, I think, for me, I think there are a lot of question marks, and to go how far. I mean, how much changes? Definitely, there have to be changes with the, Trump administration.
Okay, Mr. Feng, as you may know, the political division inside your country, the rhetoric's going on over the past few years, the president's gestures when there are crucial issues such as guns, shooting incidents, such as the issue of how to deal with Israel, many other things. It seems that it's creating ever more different opinions inside the country. It's very interesting to watch a country going to the polls when the political division is getting ever bigger and deeper. Mr. Feng, is this midterm election going to be different from your perspective?
I think it's different in the sense that for what you've described, the intensity level has risen so that we will get a very high turnout. To that extent, that's good. We want citizens to participate in politics in a peaceful way, and that's how you resolve them at the ballot box. I don't know whether or not simply participation means that we're becoming more unified as a country. But I will say that one of the troublesome things, despite all of the rancor between the two parties on some issues, is that there is very little debate, in my judgment, wrongfully, about our projection of military force everywhere around the country, running 9 wars never declared by the Congress of the United States, permitting the president to undo treaties on his own, make treaties on his own without Senate confirmation. And if you look at the long term, and despite what some believe is Mr. Trump's successes in his first 2 years, you remember we've got $1 trillion deficit in the budget. We have a national debt that's now approaching $25, $26 trillion. We're just paying the interest on the debt is running to close to $1 billion a year. We cannot continue down that path, and no one wants to actually confront these larger institutional issues that, in my judgment, are diminishing our ability to compete on a world stage.
Well, Mr. Feng, you might consider so, but will most of voters going to the polls really thinking about the issues that you just mentioned? It's a big question mark on that. I would like to also invite to our conversation Joe Rubin, who is the president of the Washington Strategy Group. Mr. Rubin, what a pleasure to have you also on the phone early hour in your time. Going to the polls today?
Well, it's great to be with you, and yes, I've actually been working the polls today in my district, and was out canvassing all day yesterday. What we canvassing is knocking on doors, door to door, asking people to go out and vote for certain candidates. So it's been a really exciting election period, a lot of energy and enthusiasm, a lot of looks from voters of course I'm voting this year. So we may have an historic turnout for a midterm election this cycle, which I think would have a big impact on Democratic candidates in particular in terms of getting them into Congress next year.
But when you look at the Congress and also the Democratic Party, Mr. Rubin, of course, you've been an ardent supporter of the party over the years. You even served in some of the Democratic administration. But having said that, though, it seems that the Democrats, despite of the controversy President Trump and the Republican Party has been creating over the years, has not necessarily standing out, in some people's words, in this election. And also, it seems to be not necessarily going to have a definite answer whether it's going to have at least one of the chambers.
Well, this is a really complicated election year, and historically, the party out of power, in this case would be the Democrats, would pick up seats in the midterm. Usually that's how American elections go, but this year, and then Democrats also for a significant amount of time had a lot of energy amongst their base voters, but President Trump has done something which is a little abnormal, but I guess we should expect from him, which is to really make it about him this election, even though he's not on the ballot. And he's been very active in rallying his voters in key districts and states and trying to turn out Republicans. And that is unique because oftentimes presidents try to avoid appearing to be on the losing end because of those historic trends. He's fighting to keep his party in power. And, you know, he does have a strong economy behind him. He is able to demonstrate that he has lived up to what he promised to his base voters. So we'll see if he's able to, in these closing days, have turned on enough Republican voters to maintain the Senate and hold back some of the losses in the House.
Right. Mr. Rubin, I mean, on the one hand, you see the China-U.S. thing going on. On the other hand, you also see the Trump administration has been making apparently some choices when it comes to the U.S. relations with the rest of the world, about unilateralism, about so-called withdrawal from some of the international treaties. If the two parties are dividing the two chambers, will things be different?
Well, what would end up happening if it's divided Congress is that the president paradoxically would have more independence and authority to execute his foreign policy regarding China and face very much a free rein to do that. But if the Democrats are very concerned about his positions on China, they can use the chamber in the House, if they take the House, to really make noise about it and criticize the president and create a lot of complicated votes for him. And that's something he hasn't experienced yet. And I don't think he really understands, quite frankly, about what it will be like to have the opposition party doing oversight, doing hearings, engaging in subpoenas to really put pressure on him. But he would have his own independent authority different from the last few years.
Thank you so much. Your insights are Joe Rubin, Bruce Fein, and also Ron Ying here with us in the Beijing studio. Really appreciate it. You are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. Big American companies do show up at CIIE, or China Import Expo. An insider puts his fingers on the pulse of U.S. businesses in China right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Program is coming to you Monday to Friday live on CGTN. The China International Import Expo, also known as CIIE, is on its second day. Over 3,600 enterprises from 172 countries and regions are attending. While the U.S. did not send any official delegation, U.S. companies still did show up big way. These include some of the biggest names among Chinese and the U.S. multinational companies like General Electronic and Boeing, Qualcomm. They're there to demonstrate their latest technologies and products. On the sidelines of CIIE, I sat down with Jacob Parker, the Vice President from the China Operations U.S.-China Business Council, to discuss the recent changes and his outlook on China-U.S. trade relations. Jacob, welcome to CGTN.
Thank you.
So the Import Expo, we see delegations from all over the world, 130 countries and regions, absence of American delegation?
Well, whether or not the U.S. government is participating today, a strong group from U.S. industry will be participating, well over 150 American companies. I know from our membership at least 30 are here. Many are presenting at the expo space, and they're also looking forward to the opportunity to engage with China's government, with many of the officials that may be a little more busy in Beijing, but while they're down here in Shanghai are interested in speaking with the business community, so it's a good opportunity for them.
The hosting of the first ever Import Expo by China, many around the world see it as a great opportunity for both China and the rest of the world to recognize the fact that there are solutions to the current trade challenges, and also countries and parties involved are making proactive measures. We want to remember that the first ever Import Expo is not being decided because of the U.S. trade war. It was being decided to be hosted by China much before the so-called trade war between the two countries. So how would you make of the significance of this event in terms of China showing to the U.S. side at least its seeking of solutions?
I think that the Import Expo shows a sensitivity in China to the recent concerns about the trade deficits that many countries run with the Chinese. It obviously offers an excellent opportunity for American firms and others around the world to export more to China. That should be welcomed by every country and every government. It is an opportunity that many of our companies see, and that's why they're participating.
If there are many opportunities to interact with the Chinese side, whether it's the business side or the government side, what would be the messages coming from you and your colleagues?
Well, the U.S.-China Business Council and our member companies are very interested in seeing a resolution to the current trade conflict between the U.S. and China. We've seen that the tariffs have created a significant amount of uncertainty for our member companies, whether it's investing in China or looking at what their next steps are in the market, or potentially looking outside of China. They'd just like to get more certainty about what the future holds. And when they speak to Chinese government officials, they'll be noting that they hope the two sides can come back together, can resume a dialogue that will help deliver some results and hopefully end the current trade conflict.
On the other hand, when you are having the opportunity talking to Washington, particularly those of the current White House and relevant department of the administration, what are your messages there?
Well, thankfully, our message is exactly the same to both the U.S. and the Chinese government.
When was the last message being sent?
We see the U.S. government frequently, at least this week, last week in Washington, D.C. We're in a very important phase of the U.S.-China relationship. We obviously have the two leaders that are going to be meeting at the G20. We would like to see China submit the final list of 142 items and its negotiating priorities so that they can ensure that the two presidents are prepared to have a substantive outcome from their meeting. And we continue to tell the U.S. government that preparing in advance, ensuring that perhaps an advance visit to China or a Chinese official to the U.S. may offer some opportunity to set up a successful visit between the presidents.
What are the responses you got from Washington?
Well, I think the best scenario is that at the end of the president's meeting, we see some kind of pause in any escalation of new tensions. As you know, the president has announced in the past that an additional $250 billion or so of tariffs may be publicly issued for comment. We would obviously like to see some kind of public announcement that that won't happen, at least in the interim. And then perhaps some announcement that the two sides will return to negotiations and work on some of the structural and trade issues that both sides have realized are more irritating to the relationship overall.
The two presidents did talk on the phone. However, it was right before the midterm election. Therefore, many wonder whether from the U.S. side it is more about the stock market than anything else. From your perspective, Jacob, to the American businesses, what are some of the messages you heard from the U.S. president particularly?
I think from our perspective, it's very positive that the president personally is now engaged in the U.S.-China relationship in a way that he perhaps has not been in the last 6 months. Elevating the dialogue from the minister or vice premier level to the presidential level ensures that there's no one that can overturn any decision that's made between the two presidents. And that ensures that perhaps we'll see a more lasting agreement. There's not going to be a negotiation between a minister in Beijing and then back to Washington, D.C., and then have different perspectives come to play. We'll know that whatever's agreed is final. I think from our members' perspective, the White House has consistently told us that there are real challenges in the China market, whether it's concerns about the role of state-owned enterprises in the economy, whether it's industrial policy and subsidies.
I understand, Jacob, in the month of September, your organization did a specific survey among your member companies that are operating in China about what do they make of the current tariffs, whether having an impact on their businesses, and secondly, whether they still have hope for the China market and what is going to be their relationship with the China market. Tell us about the numbers.
Sure. In our survey data, 90% of the companies indicated they would continue to invest in the China market in the following year, and that China remains among their top priorities globally. I think that the result of that is that our member companies continue to see China's domestic growth is very strong. They continue to expand their industrial footprint in China to access that domestic market. For those that export, which is a very small percentage of our membership, those are the ones that are thinking a little more carefully about what their next steps are in China.
A supply chain change takes quite a few years, to say the least, not to mention the cost, the human resources that goes with it. So when your member businesses thinking about their future global supply chain vis-a-vis the current political debate, what are some of their solutions back at home particularly?
So maybe I can give you an anecdote from one of our companies that I think helps illustrate this point. You're absolutely right that supply chains are very difficult to move. One of our members is a television manufacturer that does quite a bit of exporting to the United States. And when the 200 billion tariffs...
How much of their exporting is going to the United States, do you know?
Oh, well, let me say this. I would say that 95% of their product is exported from China and probably 30 to 50% is back to the United States.
Got it.
What they tell us is that when the 200 billion in tariffs was announced, they began to do their due diligence on other potential investment locations to shift their supply chain away from China. What they discovered was that the rest of the manufacturing capacity of the entire world combined doesn't meet the same capacity that exists in China today.
I see.
So even if they wanted to shift outside, they would have to at least contain part of their manufacturing here. What they also tell us is that there's an ecosystem that goes with television manufacturing. You need LED lights, you need plastics, you need glass. And developing that ecosystem takes significant amounts of time. And it doesn't exist in scale anywhere else in the world. So if they wanted to move their supply chain, they're looking at 5 years to a decade of time before they were operating at the same capacity that they currently operate in China.
This is a reality that businesses have to deal with, uncertainty, enormous amount of uncertainty, and they're going to lose money. Big way.
Not only are they going to lose money, but it's going to be very bad for the American consumer as well, because those costs are frankly going to come out of the pocketbooks of the average blue-collar American.
Earlier you told me about your suggestion of the organization to the U.S. side, establishing further communication before the G20 between the two countries so that the groundwork can be laid. How dangerous is it if there is no concrete, intense interaction from now till G20?
If there is not a concerted effort in advance of the G20, then that creates significantly more uncertainty for the meeting than probably we would like to see. In every previous administration, the negotiating points are negotiated months in advance of any presidential visit. And today we have less than 30 days before the two presidents meet. This is a real inflection point, and this is an off-ramp, one of the few off-ramps on the horizon that will allow for some resolution to the current trade conflict.
And it could have spillover effect to the other areas of the bilateral relations, certainly.
If things don't go successfully there, then I think the potential of future tariffs are very high. And frankly, the U.S.-China business and commercial relationship has always been the ballast of the overall relationship. As that voice in Washington is quieter, other voices, strategic voices, military voices are much louder. So we need to have a win on the business side so that U.S. industry can again build up that support in the United States for a more constructive long-term relationship.
My conversation with Mr. Parker at the CIIE is not limited to current trade relations between China and U.S. It also touches on how the World Trade Organization would function in the future and what will be the roles of U.S. and China in that regard. As the debate over the fate of multilateral trade goes on, Mr. Parker gives his 2 cents how American companies would make their decisions that will best suit them. About the USMCA, also about the CPTPP. However, the latter is not necessarily on the agenda. So what is the solution coming from the U.S. side? Putting pressure on everybody else?
Solution to what?
To the global trade challenges.
Well, I think that the administration has made fairly clear that they are in favor of bilateral agreements as opposed to multilateral ones. Our members would like to continue to use the World Trade Organization whenever possible and ensure that the rules-based international order remains intact. However, this president has indicated that there's concerns of the health of those organizations and that they're operating as fully and as beneficially as they can be. And I think that tariffs are one response that they're using to try and fix the issue. I had someone from the administration tell me the other day that when you're trying to fix a door, you may look for a screwdriver, but when you don't have a screwdriver, and you have a butter knife, that's what you're going to use to unscrew the screws. So I think his implication was that when you don't have the right tool for the job, you use the tool that you have. And in this case, that tool, unfortunately, is tariffs. And frankly, it has raised some attention in Geneva, and people are talking more seriously than ever about reform of the WTO and other multilateral institutions in response.
I just want to make sure, are you saying that your organization and the members of your organization would still apply to the rules of the WTO, no matter what has been the choices of trade from the administration?
So our member companies are supporters of the World Trade Organization. They continue to view it as the best method for enforcing multilateral agreements. However, they also recognize that it may not address the challenges that many of them face in today's world and market. It doesn't address digital and cybersecurity issues. It lacks any information generally on investment issues. There's not a lot on state-owned enterprises. So there's a recognition among our members that while they support the WTO and the multilateral system, they also recognize it needs to be updated and it needs to be reformed to address the challenges that businesses face today.
I understand that the WTO right now is in intense discussion among the member countries themselves about this update that you've been talking about. And they've been and are planning to host several series of discussions for the months to come. Is that the thing that your members are looking at?
Our members are certainly looking at it. Our members would have also liked to, if the U.S. had been part of the TPP as well, but unfortunately it didn't work out. So any agreement that helps raise the standards of the multilateral system is something that U.S. industry supports. It may not be 100% across all companies, but I would say the large plurality do.
Okay. On the one hand, the administration now look at bilateral. The biggest multilateral is only 3 countries, USMCA. On the other hand, American companies are operating worldwide in enormous amount of countries, just one company. What's going to be the relationship of the administration's trade choices vis-a-vis the businesses' trade choices? Jacob.
It's a big question.
It is a big question.
There's not an easy answer. I think it goes back to American elections and what the American people are feeling today. And unfortunately, for better or worse, President Trump was elected by an American population that perhaps is less open and optimistic about globalization than they were in the past. That doesn't necessarily affect industry, but for those companies that can produce in the United States and maintain a low rate of cost, then they may consider doing so. But the reality is that business will continue to operate for the benefit of their shareholders, no matter what government is in office in the United States or in China. They serve their shareholders.
Jacob, of course, the midterm election is going to have enormous amount of impact on the future of the U.S. politics and possibly how the current administration is dealing with the rest of the world. From the business community, how do you see the relationship of domestic politics and your operations worldwide and the success of American businesses worldwide.
Yeah. So when we talk to folks in the White House and in Congress, and when we talk to our companies, they tell us that the midterm elections shouldn't have much of an impact on how they operate in China. As you know, the House of Representatives, which seems to be the most likely to go to the Democrats, has very limited impact on trade or international issues. However, we do know that if the House is retaken, it will likely cause a nettlesome effect on the President and his staff, because more people will be called in to testify to Congress. It'll force them to focus much more attention on that as opposed to international trade or other policies. So I think the expectation is that that will be an issue.
Jacob, what a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for helping us understand the perspectives of U.S.-China Business Council.
It was my pleasure.
Appreciate the work that your organization has been doing over the past 40 years. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.